Adam Lawson, who is the General Manager of Relief and Recovery at Emergency Management Victoria, speaking on emergency management and the climate emergency. A terrific contribution, something that will be a really interesting insight, particularly in terms of those audiences that we've spoken about earlier today. So please join me in making Adam Lawson very welcome.
Good afternoon, and thank you so much for having me today. Thank you, Trent, for the introduction. Yes, I am not Kate Fitzgerald. She's my boss, and she's currently in Brisbane at another meeting, so you're stuck with me. Apologies around that. First slide's already clicked. So climate change, yes, it's happening. So as described, I work for Emergency Management Victoria. I've been there for about 8 years. Sorry, I've been working for government for about 8 years, and prior to that I was in the Australian Air Force for about 20 years. I found myself working for EMV a little over about a year ago in the Relief and Recovery Directorate, and it's been a real privilege to be working with communities really closely around responding to and then recovering from emergencies. During some of the realities of extreme weather, events are sharply brought into focus, and this season is projected to be no different. Victoria's communities are regularly challenged by fire, storm, flood and drownings. Every summer our emergency management sector works with communities to prepare and respond and recover from the impacts and consequences of emergencies. And so it's also important to reflect and learn. It's also important to reflect and learn from what's happening across Australia and internationally, and understand the challenging operating environment that we face as emergency management practitioners. On a global scale, we've seen this year alone the devastating effects of natural disasters in Europe and in Northern America. In fact, a raft of my colleagues have just returned from North America and Canada, where they've had some of the largest wildfire events on record. And we also sent a team to Greece that you may recall just recently had absolutely dreadful natural disaster wildfires or bushfires there as well. In January 2018, the World Economic Forum released its annual report, which identified the top 2 global risks to be extreme weather events and natural disasters. Listed at number 5 was a failure of climate change, adaptation and mitigation. And this comes at a time when the past year is among the 3 hottest on record, and the hottest without an El Nino event. Our approach at Emergency Management Victoria to understanding the impacts of climate on Victoria is evidence-based, drawing on projections from the Bureau of Meteorology, so the BOM, CSIRO, and leading sources of advice, authoritative sources of advice. The evidence tells us that Australia's temperatures are projected to continue increasing with more extremely hot days and fewer extremely cold days. More days conducive to fire and more extreme rainfall events. Winter and spring rainfall are likely to decrease, and further sea level rise around Australia in coming decades, and warming oceans. And we're seeing that with this coming season. We're expecting it to be a fairly significant season. We had a few years in a row where there was reasonable rainfall, and so therefore we had quite high growth, and therefore fuel loads are higher. And over the last year, as you all would know, it's been extremely dry, and so that means that we have larger fuel loads to deal with this coming summer. More extreme weather, natural disasters and failure of climate change mitigation and adaptation compounds the stresses and shocks that tear at the well-being, livability, sustainability and viability of our society and our environment. For this reason, Victoria's emergency management sector remains committed to better understanding the key risks that impact on communities, the key climate risks I should add, now and into the future. Because many of the impacts of climate change are already upon us, and we need to build resilience to withstand the impacts and the consequences. In our preparation for every summer, we assess the seasonal weather conditions, and that's been going on for some time now, or the climate variability, and we organise our preparation, response, recovery arrangements as required. But just as importantly, We need to connect with communities so that they understand the long-term climate projections, such as those for 15 to 30 years from now, which show us the likely challenges faced if we don't take steps to start adapting now. So we must be ready for we must be ready for the resilience challenges posed by extreme weather, natural disasters and climate change. The lessons from significant disasters in Victoria over the recent years means that all of us must remain vigilant in our efforts to reduce the adverse impacts and consequences of emergencies, the key to future uncertainty and the complexity we face through partnerships. So the Climate Change Adaptation Plan, in February 2017, the government announced Victoria's Climate Change Adaptation Plans 2017 through to 2020. The plan includes a section dedicated to preparing for and responding to extreme weather events. So EMV worked closely with the Department of Environment, Land, Water and Planning in the preparation of this particular document. The Emergency Management Climate Change Program. So the change program is a feature of Victoria's Climate Change Adaptation Plan. The program is working with communities, businesses, agencies and government to integrate climate risks, impacts and projections into emergency preparedness, response and recovery activities. So the program includes things like consolidating reforms to emergency management planning legislation by preparing ministerial guidelines to help decision makers to take climate change into account in state, regional and local emergency management planning, using the community-based emergency management planning program to connect people with the communities and to help them to use local knowledge, expertise and resources to plan for emergencies in the face of climate change. The program also includes incorporating climate change projections into risk data to improve risk management and scenario planning and to help understand and reduce the risks and consequences of future emergencies and understand future capability and capacity requirements. And we'll get to some of those bits later on. Building on the success of the Climate Change and Emergency Management Forum in 2015 to enable emergency management practitioners to develop a shared understanding of the challenges faced by climate change. These forums enable information sharing within the emergency management sector and build capability to address the risks of climate change. So risk, impacts and projections. That school bell going off? Sounds like I hope it's not a fire alarm. Don't ask me what to do. So this is an outline of the legislative framework under the Climate Change Act of 2017. So you can see there on the top right, we're talking about reducing emissions targets to net zero emissions by 2050, supported by 5 yearly interim targets. A requirement for government to have regard to climate change consideration in government decisions, policies and processes, and a process to establish system-based 5-year adaptation action plans for health and human services, transport, natural environment, water, built environment, primary production, education and training. Now obviously I'm preaching to the converted when I say Victoria's climate is changing. So climate change from an emergency management perspective is a stress multiplier. It amplifies existing shocks and stresses that we then have to deal with. We acknowledge this and we are looking at ways to understand and prepare for the impacts and consequences and taking a broad lens across all types of emergencies, including the traditional fire, flood and heat. But some of you may not also be aware of things, the effect of climate change on biosecurity emergencies, energy supply, health, pandemics, urban risks, including hazmat emergencies, and how that might impact on populations and water safety. And what is driving the behaviours to use water, the hotter days, the rougher oceans, the rising sea level. We'll talk about a few of them just now briefly. So obviously we all think of, under climate change, fire and heat. The fire seasons or the summer seasons are now longer, which for us within emergency management increases our resourcing, staff, seasonal length, and obviously the risk that our personnel are under. There are fewer days to do planned burns or risk reduction burns to protect communities. The drought issue is impacting to even be able to respond due to water scarcity. If you recall, down in Barwon Southwest, we had the fires not long ago that got into the peat swamp. And the only way that we could get enough water to put the swamp out, because some of those lakes, the water levels were so low that the peat was exposed around the edges and was catching on fire. And we had to dig trenches across about 5 kilometres of open ground from a nearby water pipeline and ship it into, or pipe it into the dam, into the lake. And as I said to you before, it impacts on staff and capacity and the number of volunteers that we have. You may not think of things like hazmat emergencies when you think of climate change, but we acknowledge that the more extreme events alongside urbanisation and population growth, whilst climate change continues to challenge us. So the more extreme weather events increases the risks of exposure with community. Example, release of toxic fumes and smoke. Infrastructure may be impacted by climate stresses such as smelting roads or rail networks buckling in heat. And population growth and urbanisation challenges compound these stresses. Animal and plant emergencies. So obviously, as we know, climate change is affecting and changing our environment. A changing environment will affect the existing potential distribution of pests and weeds and animal and plant diseases which threaten the agriculture, environmental and social amenity values of Victoria. More frequent events, such as extreme heat, flooding and fire, will challenge the agricultural sector. And we saw that down in Barwon Southwest, which we spoke about, which is Victoria's largest dairy production area. Electricity supply. This has been a real area of focus for emergency management planners and responders over the last couple of years. As more extreme weather events increases the risk of more power outages, heat can increase risk of system overload due to high demand pressures. And during storms, trees can fall over power lines, cutting supply, and outages can exacerbate existing health conditions and the impact on the most vulnerable in our community. Health pandemic. If you recall, in 2016, we had the thunderstorm asthma epidemic event that occurred in November. This was an event that was not previously anticipated and which can manifestly overwhelm the system, and that's just one example. That was the largest example of an event like that in the documented part of the world, and it's the largest call-out of Ambulance Victoria to an unscheduled event, unplanned event, since the drawn grand final of 2011, which I always found kind of amusing. Yeah. I was working for the Inspector General of Emergency Management at the time when we did the review into that event, and yeah, the previous largest event was the drawn grand final. Storms and floods. So this is an actual picture of the large storm event that we had on the 19th of December last year, and is from Euroa. So whilst the event didn't really affect us terribly here in the metropolitan area, it was a 10 out of 10 for that part of Victoria. So storms and floods are increasing in intensity and severity, and the frequency of storms and floods obviously is occurring more often. Floods are extremely costly for households, local roads, farmlands and businesses. And subversion and water contamination are risks for communities and also for us in emergency management. We spoke about it briefly before, but water safety. So we're finding that as the summers are getting longer and getting hotter, there's a real risk around water safety and an increase in the numbers of people who are either drowning or certainly having events significant events around the water. So there's life-saving infrastructure at long-term risk from weather exposure. We're talking about coastal erosion, inundation of water into areas that previously not flooded, with the sea levels continuing to rise. Certainly something that I hadn't thought about, and it's another very significant area of planning for emergency management leading into every summer season. So what does that mean for us within emergency management? The implications for EMV, we're trying to understand, we're constantly trying to adapt and be agile and understand the issues and work with the sector and our partners to be adaptable and think through the implications. We have to be prepared. The stress multiplier concept that I spoke about before manifests itself on us in emergency management in many ways. We now need to look at a broad range of consequences. So a hot day, for example, what are the consequences right across the system rather than it just being really hot and we need to sit in the shade? Our seasons are longer, they're less predictable, and they place increased demand on our services. The infrastructure and assets we rely on are more susceptible to wear and tear from weather exposure. We've got health, human safety and fatigue. The mental health issues, both for the communities and for the emergency management responders, which we all need to manage. And don't forget that the training conditions as well, whereas traditionally when I first started in emergency management, I was managing the state aviation fleet, so all the firefighting aircraft, Elvis and all the rest of it. You know, we used to have a very defined season. So at the end of the summer season, we could go into a period of adaptation, training, resourcing, and get ready for the following season. The season now is getting longer and longer, and so the time in between is getting squished, if that makes sense. That's a technical term, Trent, squished. And the aircraft that we bring in from overseas now are often required to be used for longer periods in the places that we bring them in from. So it's a challenge for all of us. We've talked about before about the thunderstorm asthma event. So with climate change, we're getting more pollution and pollen seasons that are more aggressive, I guess, affecting the air quality and increase exposure to smoke for all of us. The heat conditions and smelting road networks, impact on road and rail, buckling rail, things like that. During periods of drought and heat, we suffer from water shortages for when we're doing our operations. You think about those farm dams that used to be really full that we could go in and pick water out of and then go and drop it on a fast-running grass fire. Often those dams now are empty. It means that we now need to spend a lot more effort and time in building community resilience and partnerships and enhancing our capability and capacity, and that's absolutely essential to success moving into the future. So then obviously, getting towards the end of this presentation, it would appear to be I am at the end. There we go. So what does it mean for us, and then what can we do about it? So what we can do about it is obviously when we speak to a lot of the community members, we're talking about reducing our footprints, learning more about climate risk and opportunities and what that may present for us and for our work within emergency management. We have to explore new ways and new technologies all the time and try and innovate and transform our sector to be adaptable and agile to the ever-changing environment. It's actually an ongoing, effort for all of us to be constantly trying to move and be one step ahead of an unpredictable adversary, being emergencies and the environment. So the last of my slide here is where can you find out more information about climate change and emergency management. So there's a couple of different websites there that you can go to.
Yeah, there's one thing that I've asked a few people and never really got a good answer. If we're looking at temperatures going up into the high 40s and beyond, I was looking at split system aircon units, the newer ones, and maybe something for our local council to do in a community building as well. And they all seem to say maximum ambient temperature 45 or 43. And thermal power stations tend to chop out in those conditions as well. So what does EMV reckon we do? when those things start happening?
Gee, that's a good question. I'm not an electrician. I would imagine that the technology will adapt as the climate increases, as we're seeing with renewable resourcing. Certainly, from a personal point of view, we're in the middle of renovating a house, and it turns out that one of the most efficient ways of keeping the house cool and warm is actually those split system inverter systems. So, from my own personal point of view, we're putting in solar panels into our house, and we're putting in batteries, and we're doing everything we can there to try and be as energy efficient as we can internally. As my personal opinion, from an EMV point of view, I haven't thought about split system air conditioners and increasing their rating, but I imagine that that's another case of resilience. As the temperatures increase, people will only start buying systems that are able to deal with the conditions that we've got.
G'day. Good work today coming in, since it was a surprise. My name's James, and I just want to throw out one question for you, but I'll give you two options. If you can talk about the EMV's amendment bill or the Vine program that you guys have.
I could talk about either, I guess. The EMV amendment bill, so that's the planning legislation, has been passed by Parliament, and we're in the process now of getting ready for its implementation. It hasn't passed royal assent yet through Parliament, and that's coming, I believe. And what that means for those of you who may not be aware, it means that we are now taking a really good community-based look at planning for emergency management. And it's going to be a fairly significant change to the way we at least think about planning for emergencies and how we, I guess, simplify, which is a fairly difficult process, so that we are able to deal with communities' needs and concerns more and then that will sort of cascade up to the state level. And Vine, I'm sorry, I'm not IT, but Vine is all about the computer infrastructure network, so we have a whole team that deals with that. I know that's something that they're spending a lot of time on.
Hi, yeah. I conduct research on climate change and bushfire, but my background's more New South Wales. I've encountered a lot of rural fire service volunteers who believe climate change is happening and have no idea how to talk about it with their local people. I'm wondering what your group's doing to actually get people into a position where they can talk about climate change confidently with each other. You know, these are the guys going out during the fires, before the fires, after the fires, not really knowing what to say to people who've just had their houses burned down and things like that.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So we've certainly got a really large and a very progressive community engagement and public information section within Emergency Management Victoria. And there is a very enthusiastic and detailed, I guess, approach to both education of responders and then also working with communities within emergency management. So Emergency Management Victoria works with all of our emergency partners and agencies who are in this space, trying to keep our community safe. And it's certainly a really good question, because it's difficult to understand a lot of the time just ourselves, you know, let alone explaining how that may affect how we can help somebody who's a volunteer, who's a farmer, you know, who comes off the farm, leaves their house potentially endangered to go and protect somebody else's house. And then getting at the end of that and trying to have a conversation with someone about what is obviously a fairly difficult and at times complex subject. So it's something that we've been working on. I guess education, public information is a massive point of emergency management in Victoria, and we have probably the class, you know, the absolute class-leading personnel in that vein working within emergency management Victoria, and they're doing a fantastic job. But certainly, if you've got any ideas, I'm happy to take or have a conversation afterwards. That'd be great.
I used to organise Sustainable House Day in Geelong for 4 years, and I'm making the connection between your question. As long as orientation is not in the rating scheme for new houses being built, we'll continue to have real estate stock that is high emitting and high embodied energy forwarding climate change. So in Victoria, for example, every house, in my view, should be passive solar, in other words, facing north. But the fact that there's a disconnect between emergency management and what's being decided for developers or homeowners, what could you do to connect with the state housing departments to get some action on that, so that we've got houses that are actually perhaps even, collecting energy and water and not being part of the problem but being part of the solution?
Yeah, that's an excellent question as well, and there's certainly I can confirm that at the state level and including the national level, there is a lot of work that's going on to try and join those bits together. So we understand that planning for houses, and building is linked very closely with, the effects and the impacts on, as we talked about, power. We've talked about climate change, where we build them, what happens with the environment. So there is definitely work going on at the national level, right down to state, and then in local government level to try and join that up together. But as you can imagine, and I'm sure we all understand the complexity of it, that for a long time these sort of things hadn't been considered to be joined, and now it's understood that they are, and there's a lot of effort going in to try and make that clearer.
Can you please join me in thanking Adam Lawson
Thank you.
for joining us today?